In the winter of 1475, Europe held its breath. The Ottoman Empire, an unstoppable force that had devoured Constantinople and crushed kingdoms from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, turned its gaze northward. Standing in its path was Moldavia, a principality so small that many European maps barely acknowledged its existence. This was not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. The Ottomans assembled 80,000 soldiers, the largest invasion force they had ever sent into Eastern Europe, cavalry units that had trampled through dozens of battlefields, janissaries whose discipline was legendary, cannons that had shattered the walls of cities far stronger than anything Moldavia possessed. Their commander, Hadim Suleiman Pasha, marched with absolute confidence. He believed Moldavia would surrender before the first arrow flew. He was wrong. Moldavia's ruler was Stephen III, later called Stephen the Great. He commanded barely 20,000 men, farmers, who knew how to use a bow, minor nobility with inherited armor. A small corps of professional soldiers who understood they were outnumbered 4-1. Stephen had no illusions about fighting the Ottomans in open battle. Discipline against discipline, steel against steel, he would lose. Every calculation pointed to annihilation. But Stephen did not calculate like other commanders. He understood something the Ottomans did not. Moldavia itself could fight. The frozen rivers that cut through the valleys, the fog that rose each morning like a living wall, the marshes hidden beneath layers of snow, the narrow passes where large armies became slow, confused, and vulnerable. Stephen did not need to defeat 80,000 soldiers. He needed to make the land defeat them. For weeks he prepared in silence. Villages were evacuated, food stores disappeared. Paths through the forest were blocked or rerouted. Wells were buried under ice and stone. When Ottoman scouts crossed the border, they found a country that seemed abandoned, terrified, already broken. It was a lie. Every empty village, every silent road, every frozen field was part of a trap so carefully designed that the Ottomans would not realize they were inside it until escape became impossible. Stephen chose his battlefield with ruthless precision. Near the town of Vaslui lay a valley shaped by nature for ambush. Steep ridges on both sides, a frozen river cutting through the center, marshland disguised by snow, fog that gathered thick and blinding at dawn. It was a place where numbers meant nothing, and knowledge of the terrain meant everything. His soldiers moved into position under cover of darkness. 20,000 men spread across the ridges like shadows, invisible to the Ottoman scouts who passed below. Archers found positions behind rocks and snowbanks. Cavalry units concealed themselves in the tree lines. Small mobile cannons were dragged up steep slopes and hidden behind natural cover. Every man knew his role. Every commander understood the signal he was waiting for. Stephen walked among them in the hours before dawn, speaking quietly to groups of soldiers huddled against the cold. He did not promise them victory. He promised them something more powerful, a chance to prove that courage and preparation could stand against overwhelming force. A chance to show Europe that Moldavia would not bow, would not break, would not disappear without a fight that the world would remember. The men believed him. Not because his words were grand, but because they were true. As the first hint of light touched the eastern sky, the fog began to rise, thick, white, impenetrable. It filled the valley like water pouring into a basin, swallowing the ground, the trees, the ridges themselves. Stephen watched it spread and nodded slowly. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the weapon the Ottomans could not counter with all their cannons and cavalry. Below, in the pre-dawn darkness, the sound of the Ottoman army grew louder. The rumble of boots on frozen ground, the creak of wagon wheels, the low thunder of thousands of horses moving in tight formation. They were entering the valley, confident, unstoppable, blind. Stephen raised his hand, and 20,000 men became as still as stone. No movement, no sound, only breathing, slow and controlled, and the beating of hearts waiting for the moment when silence would shatter into chaos. The Ottomans marched deeper into the fog, deeper into the trap, and on the frozen ridges above, an army half their size prepared to teach an empire what it meant to underestimate a small nation fighting for its survival. The battle was about to begin. Dawn broke over the valley on January the 10th, 1475, but the sun brought no light. A thick fog rolled across the ground like smoke from an unseen fire, blurring the ridges, hiding the riverbanks, and turning the air into a cold, pale wall. Stephen had been waiting for this exact condition. He knew the Ottomans relied on visibility, on tight formations, on seeing their enemy before striking. Fog would break that silently, completely. The first sign of the Ottoman advance was not seen but heard. The dull, distant rumble of boots, hooves, and wagons. Tens of thousands of men were pushing their way through the narrow valley, unaware of how the ground twisted beneath the snow. They believed the Moldavians were retreating further north. They believed the valley was empty. It was not. Stephen's troops were already in position, spread across the high ridges on both sides of the valley floor. They were silent, unmoving shapes half hidden behind trees, rocks, and snow-covered earthworks. Archers held their bows steady, waiting for the signal. Cavalry units crouched beside their horses in total stillness. No fires burned, no voices rose. It was as if the entire Moldavian army had become part of the frozen landscape. The Ottomans entered the valley in long columns, unaware that the fog was hiding thousands of eyes watching their every step. As they moved forward, something else began to fill the air. The sound of Moldavian war horns. It started softly, one horn, then another, echoing from different directions. In the fog, it sounded like the valley itself was alive. The Ottomans slowed. Some shouted orders, others searched the mist for movement, but the fog gave them nothing. Then Stephen struck. A sudden roar of arrows burst from the heights. Hundreds at first, then thousands. The fog made it impossible for the Ottomans to see where the shots were coming from, but the arrows cut through the white haze and hit their ranks with brutal accuracy. Soldiers raised shields, stumbled, shouted, and tried to form proper lines, but they did not even know which direction the attack was coming from. Before they could regroup, Moldavian cannons fired. Small mobile guns hidden behind ridges. Their thunder echoed through the valley, amplified by the fog. Shot after shot hammered the Ottoman columns, breaking their formations and forcing them into confusion. As the Ottomans tried to reorganize, Stephen delivered his next blow. Light cavalry units charged out of the fog from unexpected angles. Striking the Ottoman flanks with speed and precision, they fired arrows, slashed with sabers, then vanished back into the mist before the Ottomans could counterattack. Some units hit from the left, others from the right, and sometimes from both at once. The Empire's disciplined infantry suddenly found themselves fighting shadows. In the valley, panic spread. Officers shouted conflicting orders because no one could see the full battlefield. Units moved forward when they should have held their ground. Others retreated into their own allies. The fog twisted sound, making it impossible to tell where commands were coming from. Hadim Suleiman Pasha tried desperately to regain control. He sent riders to rally scattered units, ordered drummers to signal formations, commanded his janissaries to hold the center. But every order dissolved into the fog. His cavalry could not charge what they could not see. His archers could not aim at invisible enemies. His infantry could not form defensive squares when they did not know where the next attack would come from. Stephen watched from his concealed ridge. He waited. He needed the Ottomans to be fully disoriented before unleashing the final blow. He needed them pushed toward the frozen river, toward the marshes hidden beneath the snow, toward the killing ground he had prepared with such care. Minutes felt like hours. The valley filled with the sounds of battle. Steel clashing, horses screaming, men shouting in confusion and pain. But through it all, the Moldavian attacks remained coordinated, disciplined, relentless, hit and vanish, strike and disappear. Bleed the enemy without ever giving them a target they could destroy. Then Stephen saw what he had been waiting for. The Ottoman formations were breaking apart. Units were separating, losing contact with their commanders, drifting toward the frozen river in search of escape or solid ground. They were no longer an army. They were becoming a crowd of desperate men looking for any way out of the fog. Stephen turned to his trumpeters and gave the signal. A deep rolling blast filled the valley. A sound every Moldavian soldier had been waiting for. The call to charge. From behind the fog, Moldavia's main battalion surged forward, descending the ridges in a coordinated assault. This was the strike Stephen had been saving. Infantry and elite guards sweeping down like an avalanche, hitting an enemy already blinded, scattered, and exhausted. The valley erupted into chaos. Ottoman soldiers, still struggling to see, suddenly found Moldavian infantry crashing into them from the front, while cavalry hammered them from the sides. Shields splintered. Horses slipped on frozen mud. Drums and trumpets drowned beneath the sounds of men shouting, steel clashing, and the hiss of arrows raining from above. Some Ottoman units tried to fall back across the frozen river, but the ice had weakened under days of marching. Moldavian archers targeted the crossings. Arrow after arrow struck the ice, and men began falling through into the freezing water. Those who reached the far bank discovered new enemies awaiting them. Moldavian riders had circled behind the valley and now blocked any hope of retreat. The once massive Ottoman army found itself trapped, pressed between riverbanks, fog-covered slopes, and relentless attacks from all sides. Stephen rode closer to the battlefield, though he did not enter it yet. His presence alone ignited a fresh wave of Moldavian courage. Soldiers who had fought for hours without rest found new strength. They pushed forward, pressing the Ottomans deeper into disorder. The empire's battle standards dropped one by one, disappearing into the snow. By midday, the fog began to thin. Pale light filtered through, revealing the devastation below. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay scattered across the frozen ground. Others fled into the woods, pursued by Moldavian scouts who knew every trail. The valley that had seemed so empty at dawn was now filled with the wreckage of an army that had believed itself unstoppable. Stephen gave the order to halt the pursuit. He would not let his men chase too far and risk ambush or exhaustion. The battle was won. What remained now was to ensure the victory held, to count the cost, and to send word to a Europe that had abandoned Moldavia to its fate. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. A small nation had stood against an empire and survived. The gateway into Central Europe remained closed. When the last echoes of battle faded across the valley, the fog finally lifted. What emerged beneath it did not look like the remains of a clash between two armies. It looked like the remains of a disaster. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were scattered across the frozen ground, some lying where the arrows had struck them, others collapsed near the shattered ice where the river had swallowed entire formations. The once mighty columns that had marched confidently into Moldavia were now gone, replaced by scattered survivors, struggling to understand how their overwhelming numbers had turned into a devastating defeat. Stephen did not celebrate. Not yet. Victory on the battlefield was one thing. What came after was another. He rode slowly through the valley, not as a conqueror admiring trophies, but as a commander making sure the danger was truly over. His horse moved carefully across the churned snow, while his officers reported which parts of the Ottoman force had been destroyed, which had fled, and which might still regroup somewhere in the forest to the south. The Moldavians pursued the retreating Ottoman soldiers for miles, but Stephen ordered his men not to chase too far. He understood the risks. A triumphant army could quickly turn reckless, and he refused to lose men to carelessness. Instead, he sent small, fast units, scouts who knew the land, to monitor the escape routes. Their reports confirmed what he had hoped. The Ottoman army was no longer an army. It was a mass of scattered groups running in different directions, leaderless and frozen, many without weapons, some without boots, all desperate to reach safety. Word spread quickly across the countryside. Farmers who had hidden in the woods emerged. Villagers who had fled in fear came back to their homes, moving quietly among the trees as if they were not sure whether to believe the news. Then they saw Moldavian soldiers returning victorious, carrying captured banners and prisoners. Relief washed over them. Relief mixed with disbelief. Against all logic, against all predictions, against the terrifying reputation of the empire, Moldavia had won. Stephen gathered his council that same evening. The men were exhausted, many wounded, but their faces carried something more powerful than fatigue: pride. They had stood against an army that should have crushed them, and yet they were still standing. But Stephen's mind was already on what came next. He knew that defeating an Ottoman force once did not guarantee safety. The empire was vast, disciplined, and relentless. A single setback, no matter how humiliating, would not stop it from trying again. Stephen needed Europe to understand this. He needed allies to finally realize that Moldavia was not a distant buffer, but a shield between them and the advancing empire. So he sent messengers riding through the night, carrying news of the victory to the courts of Hungary, Poland, and beyond. Their letters describe what had happened at Vaslui, not as a boast, but as a warning. If Moldavia had fallen, the Ottomans would already be standing at the gates of Central Europe. The victory had not just saved one principality, it had bought time for everyone. Across Europe, reactions were immediate. Kings and nobles who had ignored Stephen's earlier pleas now praised him openly. Chronicles later wrote that the bells of Krakow rang for days. In Rome, the Pope called Stephen a champion of Christendom. In Transylvania and Poland, travelers carried word of the battle, speaking of it with a sense of awe, as if they were recounting a miracle. But while Europe celebrated, Stephen remained cautious. He reinforced fortresses, he repaired damaged roads, he ensured his soldiers were fed, armed, and sheltered. He knew the Ottomans would recover, regroup, and return with anger fueled by humiliation. The Battle of Vaslui was a victory, but it was not the end of the struggle. Yet something had changed, something invisible but undeniable. A small nation had proven that empires could be resisted, that preparation and courage could stand against overwhelming force, that the land itself, when wielded by those who understood it, could become a weapon more powerful than any army. In the weeks that followed, stories of the battle spread like wildfire. How 20,000 farmers and soldiers had used fog and frozen rivers to destroy 80,000 Ottoman troops. How Stephen the Great had turned Moldavia's weakness into its greatest strength. How a single winter morning had stopped an empire in its tracks and given Europe room to breathe. The Ottoman Empire would not forget Vaslui. The humiliation of that defeat would echo through their military planning for years. They would return to Moldavia eventually, but never again with the same arrogance. Never again assuming that size alone guaranteed victory. Stephen understood what he had achieved. Not permanent safety, that would never exist for a nation caught between empires. But he had bought time. He had proven Moldavia's right to exist. He had shown that survival was not a matter of luck or mercy, but of will, intelligence, and the refusal to accept annihilation as inevitable. As night fell over the valley, Moldavian soldiers lit torches along the ridges. The flames flickered across the snow, illuminating the land where they had stood together against overwhelming odds. Some men prayed, others sat quietly, thinking of those who had fallen. A few simply stared at the frozen sky, trying to understand how they had become part of a moment that history would remember. Stephen looked over the valley one last time before returning to camp. It was still cold and silent, yet in that silence there was something powerful, something earned. Something that felt like the breath of a nation refusing to be erased. The fog had lifted, the battle was over. But the echo of what happened in that frozen valley would travel across Europe for centuries. A reminder that even the smallest nations, when they fight with everything they have, when they turn their land into their ally, when they refuse to surrender to the inevitable, can change the course of history. Moldavia had survived, and because it survived, Europe had a chance to breathe again.